So I guess I'll go ahead and talk about the Tommy Dreamer thing, because Dreamer's been doing the rounds in the news this week. This is one of those stories that's multifaceted. So there just isn't one take that is going to sufficiently cover the breadth of what we're actually talking about here, because it's multiple accusations to varying degrees of severity from multiple different people. Honestly, I hate these types of stories because it's the mob mentality thing, not from the people leveling the accusations. I want to make that very clear. It's from the internet. People who don't know any more about it than you and I do, but they're just like, they sense blood in the water, you know what I mean? So they swarm. I hate that shit. Let's take the OVW referee, for example. He said that Tommy Dreamer threatened to blackball him from the business. On surface level, that obviously sounds very bad. I strongly believe that everybody should have the opportunity to succeed or fail on their own merits without somebody like Tommy Dreamer abusing their influence. Now, to be completely fair and reasonable, we don't know the context in which this threat was made. Obviously, the internet is assuming the worst possible context, and it might very well be what actually happened. But for the sake of playing devil's advocate, I thought it'd be more interesting to steelman the context. Like, is there a scenario in which a threat like that could be made where it wouldn't be bad or where that it would be acceptable? So what you have to understand is in OVW you are being trained, obviously. And if you're being trained in a referee, you're being trained in an extremely important role because you are the middleman between the entertainers in the ring and the people backstage. So if something goes wrong, you have to be able to communicate. Now, if you are somebody that repeatedly displays empty headedness, a bad attitude, then you could potentially be somebody that a guy like Tommy Dreamer would say, if it's up to me, you're not having a job anywhere in this business because you're unsafe to be in that role. And not only are you unsafe, but in my estimation, you are untrainable because you have some sort of behavioral issue, attitude problem. There's guys like that. And I'm not saying that's the case here. I don't know the context. I am only steel manning the context. I recognize that Perch has people that can vouch for the fact that he is apparently a great guy, super nice dude. Doesn't necessarily mean he's a good referee. I haven't seen anything to tell me he isn't. I haven't seen anything of his work at all. I don't do a whole lot of watching OVW, I'm sorry. But like I said, I'm just still manning the context because nobody really knows at this point. When it comes to the wrestler Kennedy Hardcastle, I'm not familiar with her work. Her accusation that she put out on Twitter is that I guess at an indie show, she wanted to get hit with a Singapore cane, and Dreamer said no, let's do a spanking spot instead. And Kennedy Hardcastle, some years later, is like, oh, well, it's obviously because I'm a woman. So that last part is undoubtedly true. Like we just know Tommy Dreamer wouldn't do a spanking spot with a man. The reason he called that spot is because he was working with a woman. But the part of the accusation, I guess, that's unclear is if Kennedy feels like she was taken advantage of sexually and like she just, because of her position in the business, wasn't in a spot to say no, so she felt like she had to. It's unclear if that's what her umbrage is or if she's just like, I wanted to do a cooler spot. Because I gotta tell you, if it's just that she wanted to do a cooler spot, I don't care, man. I'm sorry, I don't care. Now, to be clear, I'm not one of these people that is like a hardliner against intergender wrestling. It's not my favorite thing in the world, but I don't necessarily have a problem with it. But at the same time, like, I just can't get worked up into a frenzy of Tommy Dreamer because he has like an old school attitude towards it. But if she does feel like, she was taken advantage of sexually, then yeah, I feel really bad about that. I hate that, that was the business at one point. And I mean, I'm not foolish enough to think that that type of stuff doesn't still go on in the business, people taking advantage of their influence and their position. That happens in every industry. And with ECW, that was definitely the flavor. And, Tommy Dreamer, was working closely with Paul Heyman, and that was the flavor of the show. I remember a spot with Rick Rude and Francine has talked about this, where Rick Rude got her in the pile driver position and just like buried his face in her ass. You know what I mean? And she's talked about that, how she wasn't comfortable with it at the time, and she just felt like she couldn't say no, and that sucks. And you go back and you watch those ECW shows, and I dare you to find a woman in the crowd. You know what I mean? It's a total sausage fest. And I don't think the business was better for it. The business might have been better in a number of ways in the 90s, but as far as the way that women are presented on TV, and the fact that you have much more women in the audience now than especially you did at the ECW shows, that's obviously an improvement, in my opinion. I believe there is a place on the show for eye candy, but eye candy isn't a license for a male performer to have their way with a female performer. Tony Khan went on a podcast recently, and he listed off 4 names that he claimed are the new pillars of AEW. The original 4 pillars being, of course, Darby Allin, Sammy Guevara, Jungle Boy, and MJF. Now, Tony Khan claims that the new 4 pillars are Kyle Fletcher, Kevin Knight, Thekla, and Mercedes Moné. Look, I don't have anything negative to say about any of those 4 talents that Tony Khan named. I've been a fan of Mercedes since she was in NXT. I'm not saying anything about those talents, I'm responding to Tony Khan. What I would say to Tony is leave it to the internet to debate this stuff. Like, all you're doing is putting your foot in your mouth. You are just opening yourself up to headaches down the road. The original idea and concept of the 4 pillars came about organically. At the onset of the company, there were 4 standout talents that were, young in their early to mid 20s, that you could say this is the future of the company. There just happened to be 4 of them, so we called them pillars. Are we to believe now that all these years later, these 4 people that Tony named are the standalone talents that stand head and shoulders above the rest of the roster? Because, like I said, I don't have anything against any of those talents, but I think there are other people on that roster that might have something to say about that. And if you're Tony Khan, why are you opening yourself up to that headache? Because all of a sudden, somebody like Kyle Fletcher says, why is Jon Moxley making more money than I am? He's not even a pillar. The reality of the situation is, at this point in AEW, it takes a lot more than 4 people to hold this thing up. So you are forcing the 4-pillar narrative where it doesn't apply. Now look, Tony Khan is passionate about his product. And when he does these media appearances, the way he gushes about his product and the enthusiasm he has for it, I find endearing. Now, your mileage may vary on that. The problem is, whenever you give these long winded, rambling answers, you run a high risk of putting your foot in your mouth. And when you're somebody that's in the position that Tony Khan is, a lot of times it pays to hold your cards a little closer to your chest. With that being said, I'm not in Tony Khan's position, so I'm not running a risk of putting my foot in my mouth. So I'll go ahead, and I thought it would be fun to list off the 4 people that I think have the most upside in AEW right now. And I wanted to keep them under 30 years old, because that's the true spirit of the original 4-pillar idea. You know what I mean? It's meant to be, this is the future. So with that in mind, my 4 pillars are Kyle Fletcher, Gabe Kidd, Persephone, and Tony Storm. Now, Tony Khan named Mercedes Moné and Thekla wonderful talents, exceptional talents. Mercedes Moné is a Hall of Famer. Tony Storm is younger than those two, and look what she has done in the company. How does Tony Khan not name Tony Storm as one of the 4 pillars? It's beyond me.